Hi, everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 26. Today, we'll discuss maximizing persuasion through word choice. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need a document to write on, as well as access to your Project 4 rough draft. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll examine the applications of rhetoric at a local or sentence level. We'll define and explore different locations to optimize word choice, and we'll discuss strategies for best determining word choice in our own writing. When you think about what Project 4 is, or what really any instance of academic writing is, oftentimes we think of really long papers. So Project 4, 10 to 12 pages, and you may be wondering, well, why are we talking about individual words that might not even take up a notable fraction of the page that fulfills the requirement we need to meet? Well, even though words are small, they can have a major impact in the development of your argument and the ways in which your audience receives the message you're trying to persuade them of. I really love this quote from Albus Dumbledore in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. He says to Harry, "Words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both inflicting injury and remedying it." And what I think this quote really gets at is that even though words are small, sometimes they can be one letter, they can be 13 14 letters long, it doesn't matter, but the words that we choose to use can have major consequences in how our writing is understood and what action is taken based off of what we say and how we say it. Let's localize and contextualize, though, Dumbledore's words to our class and to academic writing in general. So why do we care about words in academic writing? Again, if we're producing these texts that are at least 10 pages long, why do we need to be so careful and so critical about the words we choose to use in all those pages of writing? It's important to remember that words function as symbols that are tied to larger cultural meanings and values. So, a good example of how we see this playing out in today's culture, think about the word socialism, for example. So, if you say socialism to an American, that's going to function as a different symbol than, say, someone in Russia or someone in a Scandinavian country like Finland or Sweden. And so, because each culture has a different understanding of how that word is used, even though, it may refer, its denotation, so its dictionary definition might remain the same, its connotation or its cultural positioning and how it is understood within certain cultures is going to vary. And so, as you're going through and evaluating the different words that you incorporate into your writing, it's important to ask yourself, what kind of cultural value does this word have? Does it have any? How does it differ from one culture to the next? And of course, how might my audience receive this word? Also, with words, it can quickly frame your thoughts on a topic or idea. So it can help you indicate to your audience where you stand on a particular topic or a particular idea. So if you say something is bad, obviously your reader is going to understand your view on the topic differently than if you were to use a term like good. It can also help you emphasize the severity or importance of your argument. So if you say something is pressing or there is impending doom that will happen if your idea isn't implemented, obviously that increases the severity that you find is related to your topic. Also with words, and I want to go back to our first unit when we started talking about the different appeals to rhetoric. So Oftentimes, words are a common site for invoking pathos. Remember that pathos is the appeal to emotion. So many of you, when you were performing your rhetorical analysis on whatever artifact it is that you selected, many of you said, okay, well, look at this specific word that the author or the artist or the video producer used. This is the type of meaning that this word has in this culture, and this is the emotion that resulted because of it. So oftentimes, words are used to invoke pathos. Great genre that I think demonstrates the importance of word choice well would be campaign slogans. And I've just used examples from presidential elections, but of course we see that very much on a local level as well. The reason I think that campaign slogans and campaign materials are great sites for evaluating word choice is because of the limited space candidates often have. So they have to be very selective, very deliberate about the words that they use to invoke the response and create the meaning that they want. So, examples of this, looking at these examples here. So we've got Change We Can Believe In from Obama's 2008 campaign, Not Me, Us from Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign, Our Best America Yet, UN from Gary Johnson's 2016 campaign, and Make America Great Again from Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. And so we think about it, we can tinker around with each one of these slogans to really evaluate how important word choice is. So let's look at Obama's example in the top left corner, Change We Can Believe In. Think about if he had used a different word other than change. So like improvements, we can believe in. So improvements is kind of vague. It automatically implies a deficit, which could perhaps have hurt him with middle of the road voters. Let's say he had said, change I can believe in. Then that perhaps would have made him look really egotistical and really excluded his audience. If we look at President Trump's 2016 slogan, Make America Great Again. So that implies that at that given moment, America wasn't necessarily great, and so he's calling on an earlier time or a time in the past in which he and perhaps his voters would have identified America as being great. But if you think about it, let's say he didn't use the term again, and just went with Make America Great. So you think about how just the omission of the word again could have changed the way in which the ways in which voters could perceive his overall message. So we can obviously pick each one of these apart. We can tinker around. So if you were to say not me, us, which again is Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign slogan. So let's say he had said not me, we. That probably would have invoked kind of a different understanding. Perhaps people would have confused it because Obama used a lot of we in his campaign rhetoric. So maybe people would say, oh, that's really close to Obama, and might have conflated the two. So, Bernie Sanders' campaign is saying, hey, no, let's not use we because that's been used by previous candidates a lot. Let's use the term us. So again, you can see how the change in just one word in a campaign slogan can influence how we approach and understand the message that a particular candidate is trying to send. So again, these are just examples, but again, they indicate how powerful word choice can be. So when we think about sites for strong word choice, especially as it applies to academic writing, we can examine parts of the sentence like the adjectives, the adverbs, and verbs. So we'll explore each one of these in closer detail. We first want to look at adjectives. Now, adjectives are a word or phrase modifying a noun. Remember that a noun is a person, place, or thing. Now, your subject, the subject of your sentence will always be a noun, but not all nouns will be your subject. So that's important to keep in mind, but you can modify any and all nouns that you find appropriate in your sentence. So let's look at some examples. The heavy winds could damage the boats in the marina. So heavy modifies it. Heavy is going to be our adjective, and winds will be the noun that it modifies. Exposure to dangerous and potentially lethal chemicals should drive current discussions regarding nuclear energy. So we've got two adjectives, so dangerous and potentially lethal. So those are a word and a phrase, so showing how adjectives can also function as a phrase, to modify the noun chemicals. After receiving additional grant funding, the empowered students enacted positive change in their community. So this is an example of how all subjects are nouns, but not all nouns are subjects, but you can still modify them. So we've got the empowered, our adjective, students, which is both a noun and the subject of our sentence, enacted, there's our verb, positive, another adjective, change in their community. So again, we've got change, which is a noun, not functioning as our subject, but we can still modify it to create the meaning that we want. Now, if we tinker around with some of these examples, imagine, let's say for the second one, exposure to dangerous and potentially lethal chemicals. Let's say we omit those entirely. So to say exposure to chemicals should drive current discussions regarding nuclear energy. So if we don't, for our readers, define what these chemicals are or how we should understand them in the context of our argument, chemicals can be just seen sort of as a more vague noun, because chemicals can be both positive, negative, and heck, they can even be benign. But if we were to say, hey, these chemicals are dangerous and potentially lethal, then we're really emphasizing the importance or the severity of the argument that we are making. If we, but think about if we change some words around. So looking at our final example, after receiving additional grant funding, the empowered students enacted positive change in their community. So if we were to change, let's say positive to negative, that's going to completely change how our reader not only understands the sentence, but understands the students if we continue to reference them later throughout our work. So if I'm your reader and you say, after receiving additional grant funding, the empowered students enacted negative change in their community, I might think that the students are trying to mutiny the town. I could assume that the students are lazy. I could assume that the students were acting in their own self-interest. Whereas if I were to read enacted positive change in their community, I would see the students as go-getters. I would see them as ambitious. I would see them as charitable. And of course, how you frame the students in this case is ultimately going to influence how I as the reader am going to understand the rest of your references or calls back to these empowered students. So we've seen how adjectives or words or phrases that modify nouns can change meaning and shape how a reader understands the various nouns that you use in your writing. Let's look now at adverbs. So adverbs are a word or phrase modifying a verb, adjective, or another adverb. So they're more kind of general descriptive words that you're going to find in writing. When we think of adverbs, though, adverbs are designed to provide greater detail regarding how, when, where, how much, and how often. So let's take a look at some examples. In the past, companies have quietly covered their mistakes. The new fraternity will be built near the main university administrative building. Today, we are seeing the resurgence of diseases that were once considered eradicated. The blizzard invoked an extreme amount of worry among residents. Recent studies have confirmed that lightning rarely strikes the same place twice. So we can see from these examples how adverbs give us the power to provide specific details that could change the way that a reader understands a sentence or understands different components of our writing. So let's look at this first example. In the past, companies have quietly covered their mistakes. So let's say we're making an argument that consumers should have greater transparency into mistakes that companies have made. So if we say they've quietly done it in the past, we could say, okay, well, obviously these companies that we're discussing are shady and they're untrustworthy because they don't admit when they're wrong, which could potentially be bad. So by saying they've quietly covered their mistakes, so we're modifying the verb covered with the adverb quietly, then we are saying, hey, they are not going to take responsibility unless we as consumers are holding these companies accountable. So it frames how we think about the companies as well as how they approach remedying mistakes they've made in the past. The second example, the new fraternity will be built near the main university administrative building. So think about if you replaced it with far from the main university administrative building. So let's say, hey, this fraternity really isn't going to be much of a bother. It's not going to be super noisy. In fact, you can guarantee that because our new fraternity house will be built near the main university administrative building. So it's saying, hey, you know, we're going to be close to where all of the big wigs are, so we're going to always be on our best behavior. But if someone were to have said the new fraternity building will be built, the new fraternity will be built far from the main university administrative building, that's going to create an entirely new understanding for your readers to say, oh, well, if it's far away, then it's not really accessible, or, you know, the noise might get excessive, or whatever the case may be. If we look at the following example today, which gives us an idea of when we are seeing the resurgence of diseases that were once considered eradicated, maybe we're writing to say, hey, you know, we need to more carefully look at, you know, specific diseases or vaccinations, whatever, because today, right now, with all of our medical advancements, we're still seeing the resurgence of these diseases. Now, if we were to say back in the day, we saw a major resurgence, 20 years ago, we saw a major resurgence, as the reader, I could say, okay, well, we can dismiss this concern then, because obviously back then we didn't have the major medical advances that we have now. But if you, as the writer, are to say, today, right now, we are seeing the resurgence of diseases that were once considered eradicated, I, as the reader, am going to say, wow, this is a very pressing issue because we think that we are so technologically advanced and that we have all of this information on medicine and modern medicine, but if this is still a problem, absolutely, you know, we need to address it, and that kind of heightens the severity for your readers, which perhaps can make them more compelled to accept the argument that you are trying to make. Next example, the blizzard invoked an extreme amount of worry among residents. So if you were to omit the term extreme, so to say the blizzard invoked worry among residents. So if we were to say that, okay, well, how much worry? Are we kind of concerned? Is it, oh, hey, we're going to get a little bit of snow, better get the salt out? Or is it Snowmageddon is quickly approaching and we need to go to Walmart and stock up? But by using a word like an extreme amount of worry among residents, that says, hey, this is really serious. This is an issue that we need to address in some way, shape, or form, because it is invoking extreme amounts of worry among the affected people. We also can look at the final example. Recent studies have confirmed that lightning rarely strikes the same place twice. So if you're trying to alleviate stress among your readers to say, hey, don't worry about it, lightning, it's not like it's going to strike the same place twice. So if it struck here initially, you're good to perhaps stand here again. By using the word rarely as opposed to something like often, we can see how rarely omits worry or alleviates worry regarding a topic, whereas something like often might increase concern. So if we were to say recent studies have confirmed that lightning often strikes the same place twice, your reader is then going to have a different understanding of the likelihood of lightning striking the same place twice. As opposed to if you were to say recent studies have confirmed that lightning rarely strikes the same place twice. Let's now round out our discussion by looking at verbs. So verbs are what you do. A more technical way, though, of saying it would be a verb is a word or phrase indicating action. When we think about what verbs do in a sentence, they are essentially the action that is performed by the actor or the subject of the sentence. Let's look at a few examples to really assess how important verbs can be when creating meaning regarding certain concepts that we're discussing. So, predatory lenders pounce on those who miss payments. This research demonstrates that Red Cross volunteers emotionally comfort those in need, in addition to providing important medical services. In the wake of the final movie's release, Marvel fans raced to theaters to secure their tickets for Endgame. Now, when we think about how important verbs can be in creating meaning, let's look and try to replace some of these verbs and see how greatly the meaning of the sentence can be impacted by a simple change of the action or the action indicated. So predatory lenders pounce on those who miss payments. So when we think of the word pounce, we might think of something like a lion pouncing on its prey. So it creates this very hunter-hunted kind of dynamic among the lenders and those who miss payments. Let's think if we replace the verb pounce with something like reprimand or apprehend. So a lion doesn't really apprehend or reprimand its prey. So we have thrown out this sort of hunted versus hunter type imagery that we create between the different actors in the sentence. So if we were to say predatory lenders apprehend those who miss payments, perhaps, when we think of the word apprehend, we think of the police. So you apprehended a suspect. So of course that invokes very different imagery that might impact how your audience understands your argument and the severity of it. Let's look at the final example. In the wake of the final movie's release, Marvel fans raced to theaters to secure their tickets for Endgame. So let's say we were to change race to walked and secure to purchase. So Marvel fans walked to theaters to purchase their tickets for Endgame. So already we can see that changing the verbs in this sentence from race to walked and secure to purchased, it definitely takes down the severity, because if I just read, oh, okay, well, Marvel fans race or walk to theaters instead of race, I'm like, oh, well, they're not going that fast, and from secure to purchase, like, I purchased a gallon of milk. That's not terribly severe, or doesn't really stress how important this is. But if we secure something, if we race somewhere, there's obviously an importance, a severity there that we're creating for our readers. So they now understand that perhaps tickets to Endgame are important and we should view them as such, as opposed to, well, okay, it's another movie that's opening. If we had replaced raced and secure with other, perhaps not as pressing verbs. Some final considerations regarding word choice. Always keep your audience in mind. As I had mentioned earlier, different words have different meanings in different contexts and different cultures. So when we remember that words function as symbols, we want to say, okay, well, what does this word symbolize for my audience? Like I said, the earlier example, like we use the term socialism, that's going to be received differently by Americans as it would people in Sweden, as it would people in Finland or Denmark, as it would people, let's say, in Cuba or Venezuela or Russia. So we always want to be careful about the words that we use to ensure that we are using them in a culturally appropriate way. Also, don't overdo it with the dramatics. So oftentimes, and I'm actually going to tie this in with my thesaurus revision, but I'll go more in depth on that here in a second. But oftentimes, it's just best to keep it simple. Keep it accessible for your audience. And you don't have to be super theatrical. You don't have to say, um, go overboard with your description. You're not writing the great 20th century novel. And I would say even oftentimes, those writers went overboard on their word choice as well. So you don't have to overdo it with the dramatics. Rather, keep it simple, keep it accessible. Make sure that you are creating your meaning in a way that your audience can understand and engage with. Now, this also ties in to avoid thesaurus revisions. Many writers, and myself included, I used to do this quite a bit, would say, ooh, this word sounds too common, or this word doesn't sound smart enough. So they'll turn to a thesaurus and say, what's a smart sounding or, a better sounding word that I can use to replace this common word. But sometimes the common word is the best word to go with. Again, remember that words function as symbols. And sometimes the most simple or the most accessible symbol is the best because, again, your audience is familiar with it. They can engage with it. They can understand and appreciate the context in which you are using that word as it functions as a symbol for them. And so sometimes when we think about thesaurus revisions, we'll say, hey, this word sounds really cool, but if our audience doesn't understand it or if it doesn't function as a symbol in an effective way, then we've lost our audience and perhaps we've lost our argument too. And last but not least, understand the impacts your words have on the overall argument. So like I had mentioned earlier with the students example, so if I said, hey, they had a negative impact on the community, obviously that is going to change how my audience understands the role of the students, which could very well impact how they understand my overall arguments. Maybe I'm saying, yeah, students are awful. They were bad with their grant funding. So that could affirm what I'm saying. But if I were to later justify the students and say how wonderful they are, that might cause confusion with my reader to say, wait, you said they did bad things in the community with their grant funding. So it's always important, especially if you are using words that have high emotional impacts for your audience, you want to be aware of what those impacts are and how your audience will understand them in the context of the argument you're providing them. Now let's talk about the lecture assignment. I'd like you to review your current draft for Project 4. I want you to identify one adjective one adverb, and one verb that you believe can be stronger or that you would like to replace as it helps you better develop your argument. Replace each selected word or phrase. So replace the adjective, adverb, and verb that you identified with one that you find more appropriate and one that you find will help you strengthen the persuasiveness of your argument. And what I want you to do after that is compose a brief rationale, so about 30 words each. You don't have to write a novel for each selected word or phrase change. So you will say, okay, originally this was an adjective I selected. I changed it to this. Really briefly, here's why. Here's the adverb that I changed. Here's the adverb that I originally had. Here's what I changed it to, and here's why. And then you would follow suit with the verb as well. So for your weekly homework, here's what I'd like you to do. Include the Core Lecture 26 summary and assignment in your Week 14 homework submission. Overall, your Week 14 homework submission should include these summaries and lecture assignments for Core Lectures 26 and 27, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And that is all due to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, April 14th. If you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.